going to get started. My name is Jane Huckabee. I direct the International Human Rights Clinic here at Duke Law. And it's my pleasure and privilege to be having us all here today in conversation with Dr. Sumi Maddock, who has written an extraordinary book entitled Vernacular Rights Cultures, The Politics of Origins, Human Rights and Gender Struggles for Justice. This event today is part of our Human Rights in Practice series, which is co-hosted by the Centre for International Comparative Law and the International Human Rights Clinic. And as I mentioned, we're really privileged to have with us today Dr. Sumi Maddock, who's Professor of Political Theory and Gender Studies in the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science. There's a lot to talk about in this book. I read it in one sitting, and so I'm excited to be able to go through and have a conversation about what is really a key way of retelling and reinterpreting and undoing a whole bunch of biases and perspectives that we have baked into the global human rights scholarship and system too. So it's a very rich book and a rich conversation that we'll be having today. What we'll have is Dr. Maddock will present for about half an hour or so, and then we'll have a chance to really have a Q&A. So let's jump in and really get into the issues and the methodologies that are surfaced through this work. Thank you again for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good evening to everyone who's come. Thank you, Professor Huckabee, for the introduction, and to colleagues at Duke Law for the invitation to come and talk about the book. I'm sorry I'm not there in person with you. And I just wanted to also say that I'm super delighted that so many colleagues came together to co-sponsor the talk. So anyway, thank you very much, and it's very lovely to be here. Well, at least virtually this evening where I am, which is in Kassel in Germany, and this afternoon where you are in Durham. So I've been very excited actually to come to give a talk this afternoon. When the invitation came my way, I immediately said yes. Primarily because I've been very excited to track the travels of the book as it has reached different readers in different locations, and I've learned a great deal actually from the reception and readership of the book in different parts of the world. And so I look very much forward to your thoughts and to your comments on the book, but also how we can collectively come together and draw on our collective intellectual resources in order to open up different avenues for conversation about thinking about rights and human rights politics in most of the world. So I have 4 minutes or thereabouts. Okay, so in which to take you on to what is really going to be a whirlwind tour of the book. Okay. But by all means, just ask maybe Q&A. We can pick up points that you want to focus on in particular, and so on. So by way of the book and its the introduction to the book really and its key projects, let me just take you to the deep end straight away by way of a short preamble, the key questions that drove the writing of the book. So at this point I'm going to share screen because the book is, as you all know, is mostly a multi-layered project and there are several parts to it, so I thought I just might make it a bit more friendlier to your ears if I were to just, and to your eyes if I were simply to kind of put together a set of PowerPoints which would sort of talk a little bit about the multi-layered nature of the book. Okay, so but before I do that, before I take you to through some of the key questions that drove the writing of the book, I want to draw your attention to the book cover, and I'll come back to the book cover in a bit. But just to say at this point that the cover does some crucial work in the book, and in some ways many of the clues to the book's key questions lie in the cover itself. So then, let me go very quickly to perhaps the biggest question that the book sets out to ask, and it's really this: how to tell different stories of rights politics in most of the world. Now, how to tell stories of rights and human rights that sidestep not only the dominant or hegemonic human rights stories, but also sidestep the dominant and hegemonic critiques of global human rights stories that we've become so accustomed to hearing and telling and critiquing. As scholars who, like yourselves, who work on human rights, you're all very familiar, of course, and with these stories, and you don't need me to tell you, but these stories. But at any rate, let me just sort of go over very quickly some of them. As you know, these hegemonic stories of human rights focus very much on originary questions, but they also focus very much on the powerful efforts by the powerful institutions, including nation states, to institutionalize global human rights. And more recently, these stories have also cast their attention to their travel, translation and vernacularization of global human rights into the local or into the other worlds. And of course, global human rights, as you know, are inordinately preoccupied with stories about humanitarian and military interventions by global powers to secure human rights around the globe. But it's of course, when I say let's sidestep some of these dominant and hegemonic stories, it's not, of course, easy to tell different stories of human rights politics. For one, we have to be careful that we don't tell these different stories through enacting and categorizing difference as cultural, custom, tradition, local, or as case studies of global human rights talk. And furthermore, we have to be super vigilant that we refuse any talk of difference that speaks of difference while keeping the epistemic frameworks of global human rights talk intact and impervious to any serious consideration of the difference that historical difference makes to global rights talk. In short, we have to find ways of telling these other stories of world-making and meaning-making on rights without either reproducing the vast epistemic power and time-space provincialism of global human rights discourse, or compromising the complexity, dynamism, difference, and epistemic and political struggles for human rights in most of the world. Now, for some years now, I've been insisting to tell a different story of world-making around rights and human rights. And I tell the story of vernacular rights cultures. The stories of vernacular rights cultures, which is also the title of my book, foregrounds the struggles for rights and justice by subaltern groups in most of the world. These are stories of critical conceptual vocabularies, subaltern mobilizations, and of conflictual gendered politics of rights. They're stories of struggles for economic redistributive justice, but also for representational justice. And they're stories of conceptual diversity, of oppositional politics, of protest against authoritarianism, and of the political imaginaries that animate subaltern rights politics, but also open up different futures and possibilities for rights and human rights around the globe. Now, importantly, these stories refuse what I call the politics of origins. Now, driving the scholarship on politics on global human rights is an inordinate preoccupation with this politics of origins, which is really a racialized and binary global human rights discourse which stipulates that human rights originate, belong, travel from, and operate for the West. The politics of origins is shared by not only celebrators and detractors of human rights, but also by critical and progressive scholarship on human rights. In other words, there's nothing partisan about this politics of origins. And this politics of origins actually puts in place particular forms of racial, epistemic, and political erasures. The story of politics of origins, as I was saying earlier, is foremost a racial story, as scholars have noticed. Institutional histories of racism haunt historical, philosophical, and legal accounts of human rights. In more recent times, the politics of origins contributes to eclipsing the role of anti-colonial movements against imperial powers, preferring to focus on the role of Western lawmakers and peacemakers, but also in epistemically silencing the scale and momentum of contemporary rights mobilizations and claim-making across the globe. Significantly, the politics of origins organizes the global human rights discourse into a series of binary distinctions. And you will recognize some of them, right? The key ones being West, non-West, universalism versus cultural particularism, Asian values versus Western political and civil human rights, and so on. Now, the binarism of rights talk has led to a spectacular failure to pay attention to forms of rights politics, political cultures, and the modes of activism engaged by subaltern groups in most of the world, not least by nation states who have deployed the binarisms of rights talk to silence democratic aspirations to great effect. Now, the politics of origins is, of course, not without consequences, as I was alluding to earlier. In the hands of detractors, and particularly authoritarian nation states, it places a politically expedient argument to delegitimize modes of protest and questioning of excessive state power on the basis that human rights are illegitimate, alien, foreign, therefore with little cultural traction and legitimacy. In critical progressive scholarship on human rights, on the other hand, the originary story shores up the West as the epistemic subject of human rights, although this time via critique, and through displaying willful ignorance and historical amnesia around rights struggles in most of the world. In other words, you can be a very sophisticated theorist of human rights and producing very sophisticated critiques of human rights, but really having been under no obligation to know anything about rights mobilizations in most of the world. Now, I want to actually draw your attention to a specific effect of this politics of origins, which is the pervasive time-space provincialism of historiographical, philosophical, and moral kind that characterizes human rights scholarship. By time-space provincialism, I simply mean that the epistemic center of human rights intellectual thinking is temporally and geographically located in the West. So even the timeline of originary stories of human rights might shift, and this is what we've been seeing in the last 10, 15 years, that the timeline of the originary stories have shifted. So if it's not the French Revolution and American Declaration of Rights of Man, it's Amnesty International. So even if that timeline shifts, the location of human rights stories remains steadfastly in place, with the result that the geopolitical context of epistemic inquiry remains stationary. Now, the important work that time-space provincialism does is that it invests epistemic authority in the global north, thereby leading to a lack of theoretical, philosophical, and conceptual work and attention to rights struggles in the global south. Right? So wherever they appear as case studies, but not conceptually, not epistemically, and certainly not philosophically. And the widespread time-space provincialism in human rights scholarship shows up in its predominant focus on post-World War II Anglo-European stories of growth, spread of global governance, international law, international institutions, global histories and politics of globalization, neoliberalism, global NGOs, and more recently of accounts explicitly focused on pursuit of global justice and the growth of Western-sponsored international humanitarianism. Now, these dominant stories of human rights that populate conservative and liberal accounts, but are also rehearsed by radical democratic theorists, and they have led to a widespread acceptance of what I call the depoliticization thesis, that not only silences and eclipses accounts of the ongoing mobilizations for rights in most of the world, but has also resulted in the absence of at least two kinds of inquiries. First, it has meant that human rights mobilizations in most of the world have yet to centrally preoccupy scholarship on human rights within radical democratic theory and political philosophy, which continues to be predominantly focused on the Euro-American experience of the right to have rights, and on the paradoxes and aporias resulting from the founding or originary moments of republicanism, i.e. the kind of abstract philosophical and theoretical problems set up by the French and the American revolutions. Second, despite the growing awareness for a need for scholarly work on human rights and rights in different parts of the globe, you often see that kind of, hand-wringing, we need that work, right? There exists a striking lack of scholarship that is explicitly aimed at not only tracking alternative genealogies of human rights, but also producing conceptual work that captures the stakes and struggles of rights and human rights, besides also being able to critically engage, challenge, and speak back to the scholarly field of global human rights. Crucially, theoretical and philosophical critique of global human rights alone cannot account for the life world of subaltern struggles for rights and entitlements. For quite simply, the terms of the critique of global human rights have been such that these end up resurrecting and reproducing the object of their critique, i.e. the West as a subject, while also reproducing global epistemic inequalities. Critiques, though hugely useful and hugely significant, indeed was to find the constellations of power and their entanglements, must only be the starting points for the production of new intellectual and conceptual histories, geographies and epistemologies of rights from different locations around the globe. Now, it turns out that that you simply can't, tell these stories of rights politics in most of the world without also engaging seriously with the question of global epistemic justice. Now, by global epistemic justice, I mean to take seriously epistemic interventions from the Global South in a way that matters epistemically. So not as case studies, not as a local variant of the global, or culturalized away as custom or vernacularized, but as speaking to, with, alongside, and also speaking back to global rights and justice discourses. By epistemic justice, I also mean to critique the hardwired colonial unknowing and methodological insularity within the scholarship and politics of global justice and rights on the one hand, but also the methodological nationalism when people do people in fact talk about world making the global south, right? So the moment you talk about politics in the global south, they immediately slip into methodological nationalism. And the problem with methodological nationalism, but also the sort of great men stories that are not only our nation states, the problem with those kinds of stories is that not only are nation states amongst the chief violators of rights through their security, development, and corporate apparatuses and interests, but also because of the low legitimacy of this nation state to represent subaltern groups who have historically been at the receiving end of irresistible state violence. Now, key to then global epistemic justice are questions of epistemic presence and epistemic accounting. And both of these have preoccupied me for a very long time. And so I argue in the book that the epistemic presence of rights politics in most of the world must insist on an epistemic accounting of rights politics, right, of this rights politics. By epistemic accounting, I mean of the stakes and struggles that animate this politics, the conceptual repertoires that informs it, as well as the rights subjects that come into being in the wake of this rights politics. The appearance of rights politics in most of the world as an epistemic presence is crucial for shifting the epistemic center of knowledge production on global human rights. Now, I've been tracking rights politics by subaltern groups, especially within large citizen mobilizations for rights for the best part of 2 decades now. But it was very clear to me that in order to give an epistemic accounting, I could not use the global human rights framework, as that would be to activate not only the serious charge of a technical application of theory, but it would also invoke the serious charge of reproducing and authorizing the epistemic and geopolitical power of global human rights discourse. And so clearly I needed to find another way of entering this field of rights politics without either reproducing, as I said, the huge epistemic power or the time-space provincialism of global human rights discourse, and also not compromise at the same time the dynamism and the epistemic presence of this rights politics in most of the world. So in order to give an epistemic accounting of this politics, I've had to devise a theoretical framework. So vernacular rights cultures is this framework for the study of rights politics in most of the world. But I've also had to devise a methodological device, i.e. how to study the rights politics in most of the world, which I call a feminist historical ontology. Now, I'm not sure if I'll have enough time to get into a feminist historical ontology, but I'll leave it to you to ask me if it interests you, at the end of the talk. So thinking through and with the lens of vernacular rights cultures then allows the curation, assembly, and the documentation of different registers, imaginaries, and possibilities of and for rights encounters in the world. These different registers interrupt state-centric, but also well-rehearsed originary stories of temporalities, global institutional histories, and abstract subjectivities, which are the staple of global human rights discourse, to generate historically specific discourses of rights, replete with their own languages of claim-making, subjectification, and world-making. Significantly, as I was sort of saying to you earlier, that the stories of vernacular rights culture signal that a theoretical and philosophical critique of global human rights alone will not do, right? And we need to find other ways, moving beyond critique, taking on board the important interventions of critique, but then going beyond that and not simply resting at the level of critique alone. But you might ask me at this point, well, okay, so fine, you say all this, but how to insist on this epistemic presence of rights politics in most of the world? And an important way to do this is to insist on producing conceptual descriptions of the languages of rights and human rights deployed across the globe that attend to the critical vocabularies, political activisms, and different philosophical perspectives which animate this rights politics. It bears worth repeating that the production of concepts from most of the world is a matter of great urgency. Concepts, we need concepts to visualize our world, right? So concepts are the building blocks of theory. We need concepts to visualize the world and also to build theory with. We simply do not have the concepts we need in order to produce theorized accounts of our different historically specific encounters within the world. Now, the vernacular in vernacular rights cultures, just to kind of make it clear, is an epistemic positioning, right? It flags an epistemic position in relation to the hegemonic global human rights discourse. But it also crucially flags the different literal and conceptual languages of rights deployed by subaltern groups across the world. And at this point, let me go back to the cover of the book. As I said to you, the cover gives away many of the clues. So you'll notice from the cover of the book, I'm not sure how clear it is but the cover of the book has the word hak written across it in 8 different languages, although let me put it the other way. The word hak appears, has an epistemic presence in at least 8 languages that I've been able to track and many more. And appears on the cover of the book in Hebrew, Hindi, Manipuri, Persian, Swahili, Turkish, Urdu, and Arabic. And for those amongst you who read these languages would know that the word hak is the principal word for a right in all of these languages. The word itself is traced to classical Hebrew. It appears in pre-Islamic poetry and then in the Quran, and it's also found in the older Semitic languages like Aramaic and Lydian. And over the centuries, the word has traveled across continents to become the principal word to signify a right in South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. All of these regions use the word hak to speak and to denote a right. Hak appears in Hindustani and Urdu lexicon, and this is in South Asia, where I've been tracking it for about 2 decades, through the influence of Persian in the Indian subcontinent, where it cuts across geographical, religious, and linguistic boundaries to become the principal word deployed to claim rights by subaltern groups in northwestern India and in Pakistan. Evidently, the word hak is remarkably cosmopolitan, has an epistemic presence across 2 continents and 8 languages at least, and I think many more. In my work, I've taken, the word hak, of course, is hardly confined to South Asia, and it does not recognize national borders and formations. If anything, it undermines them. So I was sort of saying to you that I've been tracking, the word subaltern mobilizations for about 2 decades now, and these subaltern movements. This is just to give you a sense of the tracking that I've done. The movements I've been tracking are subaltern movements, including indigenous and Dalit mobilizations demanding right to food, employment, public information, accountability, and land rights in India and in Pakistan. And in India particularly, I've been looking at the Right to Food movement, which is an umbrella organization that includes a number of citizenship struggles in Pakistan. I've been tracking the Anjuman Mazareen, or the Tenants Association of Punjab and Rural in Pakistan, which has been demanding the restoration of ownership and sharecropping rights to the land taken over by the Pakistani military. And actually, it's emerged in post-colonial Pakistan as the most significant working class movement to challenge the authority of the military in Pakistan. Now, so what I've been doing in all this, of course, I've been tracking the way that groups have been deploying, claiming, and using hak to claim rights. But I've also been looking at the ways in which hak appears as a conceptual and epistemic presence Haq operates as a normative concept that exists within complex and capacious imaginaries that are juridical but also political. And my conceptual work on Haq has involved documenting the different justificatory premises of Haq that animate but also sustain political mobilizations, while also putting in place a very particular relation to the self. And these justificatory premises at times intersect with liberal democratic theorizing on rights and human rights, but also at times turn away towards a radically different direction. And so what I've been doing in terms of looking at the conceptual accounting of what Haq is to, as I said, to document the key justificatory premises of Haq, the ways in which Haq is used and demanded and founded on. So some of the key justificatory premises are citizenship, so on the basis of citizenship, so Haq is used to demand citizenship rights, but it's also seen as a cosmological right, seen as an Islamic ideal, and also in moral terms as an ideal of public life. So let me give you a sense of what it actually means. Give you a couple of examples, not a lot, just one or two, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here. So the political imaginary of Haq as citizenship. So this is a short excerpt from a very sort of days-long conversations with members of the NPSS, which is one of the kind of founding members of the Right to Food movement in India, and this is, like I said, a conversation that took place over days and days and days, and this is just an excerpt, and it gives you a sense of how citizenship is used as a justificatory premise of Haq. So, as citizens, we have Haq over this road. The road is built with our money. It is our money because we pay income tax, and we pay also tax on whatever we buy, such as rice, dal, cooking oil. That is how the Sarkar, which is the state of the government, builds hospitals and schools. It builds it with our money. And the money that people think is Sarkari or belongs to the government, or the building that is deemed to be Sarkari or belong to the government, we say to them, it is not Sarkari, it is our building, it is our money. Our democracy must be safeguarded, for that will make our rights safe. And our effort should be that the Constitution continues to guarantee the rights of citizens. This is just an excerpt, and of course it's been, in the book I talk about how when you actually push this idea to its logical conclusion, what emerges at the end of it. And just another sense, this is conversations again over years with indigenous groups demanding rights to ancestral forest land. So Haq as a cosmological right. So earlier we used to take the produce openly from the jungles and without any restriction, and suddenly we were told there was a prohibition on the forest produce, as this was now going to be a sanctuary built by the state government, a sanctuary for wild animals. So this is land taken away from indigenous groups, and then indigenous villages, lands belonging to indigenous villages taken away by the state in order to build a sanctuary for wild animals. We were told that we could not build homes or rear our animals or sow the field inside the jungle. We were told this was not protected land and a sanctuary, and that they were going to develop a park, a national park inside it, and that tourists were going to come from abroad to visit the sanctuary. We continue to take the produce from the forest. We only take what we need. We are the owners of this jungle and the lands. We have a Haq over these. Wherever there are Adivasis, wherever they're indigenous, there are jungles. In the cities, there are none. We have protected them. The Haq over these forests and water comes from our ancestors. These are our sacred lands. Our ancestral spirits reside here. We have ancestral rights over these lands. Our forefathers have used this land for centuries. We tell the state forest officials, you do your job, stay here, and that together we can stop the jungle mafia who go into the jungles in their lorries illegally and for commercial purposes, but you cannot stop us taking the produce for our own use from these jungles or forces of our land. And finally, just a very quick one on Haq as an Islamic ideal, and this is with activists of the Anjuman Mazari in Pakistan. The interesting thing here is that, of course, yes, they are using Haq in that, directly sort of relating it to a Quranic passage, but the use of it is towards a secular end. The word haqq comes from Islam because Islam clearly marks out a very clear definition of the practices and conduct that constitute right behavior. Islam invokes haqq in two separate ways. Haqqu Allah, which is to do with right conduct in the discharge of religious obligation, and haqqu al-abad, which relates to right conduct in respect of other human beings, including towards my government and my family. The right to cultivate and possess ownership, right? Ownership of this land is prescribed in the Holy Quran. For instance, in the Quran on paragraph 3, it says very clearly, if someone cultivated the land for 5 years, he then becomes the owner of the land. Therefore, the Mazarin have a right, therefore the Mazarin, which is the struggle, have a right over the land which is justified by Islam itself. So you sort of see the ways in which all kinds of different intellectual resources are brought in order to make very particular kinds of claim. So I suppose what I want to now do is to very quickly talk about what it does, what this means for thinking about what does haqq do for thinking about reorienting rights and human rights politics. Now, a couple of things that kind of come out from this is of course that haqq is seen as non-derivative from the state. Now, this is quite a big move because, of course, in liberal democratic theory there is an umbilical cord between the state and citizenship rights, right? Between state and rights. And so even though, but haqq is non-derivative from the state, so the first example, the first excerpt that I was talking about in terms of citizenship right actually went pushed to talk about, well, if the government takes away your rights, what are you going to do? Well, we'll have to kind of get rid of the government and so on and so forth. So there is that kind of insistence that rights actually do not come from the state. So, but even though non-derivative, rights require implementation by the state and therefore the claim, right, to the state. And so haqq is a dynamic idea, a dynamic concept, and has justifications independent of the state. And so therefore, haqq doesn't only posit symmetric and correlative relations between itself and the positive legal order of the state. It exists independent of law and has a moral authority of its own. So it's not only simply sort of, thinking about what are the correlative relations between itself and the positive legal order of the state, right, in terms of, dual correlatives. It's not, it's not engaging in those kinds of discourses. Unlike moral individualism espoused by dominant rights discourse, haqq is not only the moral property of self-regarding individuals. And I say that, there are various kinds of gradations to it, but it is not only the moral property of self-regarding individuals, and it does not engage in establishing dual correlatives between pairs of individuals, right? So it's not that Hofeldian exercise in which, in terms of establishing that kind of dual correlative, but it signifies relational connections. And so, therefore, what I'm trying to sort of say here is that there are haqq posits non-dichotomous relations between the individual and the public good. And it signifies a cosmic inseparability and indivisibility of the individuals from the public good, and that's what you sort of saw in that little excerpted narrative of the, with indigenous activists, for example. The other thing that comes out quite clearly is that neither humanism nor moral sovereignty of the individual or their interests, whether collective or individual, underpin the justification of haqq. So, in that sense, it's, there is, it exceeds humanism. And is not confined to only being consistent with humanism. So, in the sense that there is a duty to uphold a normative order that includes duties to protect nature, for example. And so, therefore, it is not only duties towards other sentient beings. Having said all of this, it's a dynamic concept, but it's not a horizontal concept. So, we're not talking about some kind of a horizontal utopian concept. It's very much located within structures of power and conflict and all of that generates, and it's kind of generative of that as well. But It's a dynamic concept, but it's not a horizontal concept. And one of the reasons why it's not a horizontal concept, and there are lots of other reasons, but here's one of the reasons, in all of the movements that I have been tracking now for 20 years, or coming up to 20 years, Hug for Women, and I'm talking about simple women's rights discourse, right? I'm talking about the one that's kind of stamped, on and signed off by states, by state development programs, kind of very standardized sort of women's rights talk, signed off by institutional agencies and NGOs and so on. Even that, so I'm not talking about sexual rights, I'm not talking about LGBTQ rights, I'm simply talking about women's rights for women, has had to be begged separately in all of my tracking of subaltern political struggles. Nowhere has it actually occurred organically as part of the struggle. It's always had to be begged separately. And so that tells you something about the non-horizontal nature of HUC, but also the political conflicts that are generated, when engaging in rights talk. But it also brings together formulations of politics of rights with the politics of justice. And that's quite interesting because one of the critiques of human rights, global human rights discourse, apart from it being minimalist and moralist and and so on and so forth, is also that it has no justice project, right? Primarily because of its minimalism. It is not interested in the politics of justice. And if so, in a very, very minor way through what is seen as global justice talk, through some kind of version of ideal theory. Now, this is actually moving away from those conceptions of ideal theory and thinking about what it might mean if we think about the politics of rights and human rights as the politics of justice. And I said I wouldn't talk about feminist historical ontology now, but if you're interested, I might just come back to it because I'm very mindful of the time and I think it might take me more than 4 or 5 minutes to talk about it. But let me just go over very quickly, and this is the last slide, about vernacular rights cultures and rights politics in most of the world. What does it actually do for thinking about rights politics? What does the framework of vernacular rights cultures do? So what's the intervention, right? It enables the epistemic presence of rights politics in most of the world. And that's one of the key interventions that it makes. It also disrupts the methodological nationalism, as in i.e. the nation state as a unit of analysis, right? So every time one thinks about human rights, the global south, people start going on to their the registers of the nation state, really. But as I was sort of saying to you, because of the difficulties around methodological nationalism, primarily because nation states themselves are the chief violators of rights, but also because of the failure to be able to represent the groups that they actually violate rights of, there is a problem in just kind of focusing on nation states. And therefore, moving towards a much more transnational analysis allows us to look at the modes of power in different locations around the globe. It also provides a counter to ideal theorizing on justice. I kind of alluded to very, very quickly, and this is some of my more recent work in which I'm thinking about, how these interventions of thinking about rights politics as the politics of justice actually intervenes in how we think about global justice. And that means moving away from kind of ideal theorizing to non-ideal theorizing, to looking at questions of injustice on the ground and building theory ground up from there. It also, of course, focuses on conceptual production in most of the world, right? So we're talking about epistemic accounting and epistemic presence, and my insistence here is that we need to be able to produce conceptual accounts of rights politics and rights languages, right? So then we move away from this focus on sort of looking at global south as kind of field work encounters, whereby the field is simply in terms of getting data and empirical sort of case study kind of information, which does very little to shift how we might actually theorize and frame how we are thinking about questions of rights and indeed frameworks for rights politics. And places a question mark on what I've sort of referred to as the depoliticization thesis, right? So it's very familiar, depoliticization thesis. We can't sort of, even sort of moves without kind of constantly sort of worrying about the fact that we all become depoliticized under neoliberalism, that, we're all become depoliticized subjects with no interest in questions of justice, politics, and so on and so forth. We're all looking at our own kind of self-interest and how to maximize self-gain and so on, right? So that's the kind of depoliticization thesis, which of course a number of theorists have written about. They haven't written about the depoliticization thesis, they have written about the depoliticization thesis, but not in the way that I'm talking about it. They are talking about the death of the homo politicus, that under neoliberalism, political citizenship is under great threat and is dying, and so on and so forth. And every time that question is raised or that description is made, I often ask them, where are you looking, right? And so it's very important to ask that question, where are you looking? Because the context that I'm looking at, it's certainly clear to me that political citizenship is something that people are fighting for on the ground, and there's so many rights mobilizations around the question of citizenship. So I'm always struck by where people are looking to formulate their grand theses. And then it also disrupts two assumptions of global human rights discourse. One which is violent, universal, and unidirectional translatability and commensability, and the second is radical unintelligibility. The first trap of force and violent commensability leads to theoretical and conceptual misdescriptions of rights politics in which the world, right? Because the insistence that everything that there is unidirectional translation, right? So global human rights travel from a particular center, they travel elsewhere, they're translated in the local languages, but there is no coming back, right? Because there is only unidirectional travel. And when they reach that other place, they are translated into the local languages, and then there is a direct and simple translation that occurs, right? And so that leads to a range of misdescriptions and epistemic erasures. And radical unintelligibility, on the other hand, leads down the poisonous rabbit hole of cultural relativism. So vernacular rights cultures and the focus on conceptual languages across the globe is a key way of diffusing the assumptions of universal translatability or unidirectional translational practices, but also of radical unintelligibility, of shutting the conversation altogether. And then, finally, it is also to do with allows epistemic accounting of political subjectification or of self-making or making up people. I mean, this is making up people is, I borrow from the philosopher Ian Hacking and his work on historical ontology, and therefore the methodological device that I was talking about earlier, how to do this work of feminist historical ontology, which is to look at how rights languages and rights politics and how people are being constantly made up and through their deployment and involvement and articulation and activism in rights politics in most of the world. I think I'm going to stop here because I think I may have exceeded my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That great presentation. Should we go to the floor? I have some questions, but I want to make sure that everyone in the room has a chance to engage on the material as well. Anyone have any questions they'd like to ask of Professor Maddock? Shall I start? And then you can percolate and then maybe we'll go on. Okay, so I was struck by the piece you talked about of the haq for women, and really struck in your book when you're describing, sort of part of the book describing sort of gendered narratives and gender counter-development, in which you say that despite, the ways in which haq, as you presented it, is capacious and capable of many different foundations, but in practice, when you have gender equality and rights claims, you argue they're almost always justified in terms of existing legal and constitutional guarantees, and don't actually draw upon this capacious historical or religious, cosmic, other foundations of haq. Maybe you can talk that through a little bit as to how you account for that and what the effects of that are in terms of rights politics. Let's begin with that, and then we'll. So let's just go to time. For timing wise, we have about 10 minutes. So I'll come back to the group for more questions. But if you could begin with that question, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yes, I mean that was one of the things that I wasn't in the sense that I wasn't very, very surprised that was the case because of course of my earlier work, which was looking, which had actually looked at rights, the ways in which women development workers and state-sponsored programs for women's development were sort of, came across or were trained in the languages of rights. And of course, these women, had said to me that they never come across the fact that women had rights ever before, and that, or indeed, Dalit women and Adivasi women, that they had rights was something completely, alien. And it wasn't that they hadn't heard of the word for rights, which is haq, but the fact that it applied to them was something which they had never even occurred to them. There was not something they'd seen in practice. There had never been a kind of a living memory, anything that resembled the practice of haq for women. Now, so I already knew that, that this was going on, but I was very struck by the fact that in all of these radical political mobilizations, which were very articulate. I mean, they articulate the demands in the language of rights, yes? So the language of haq is very forefront, it's center stage, forefront, and so on. But when it came to talking about women's rights, they had to be read separately so that it never came up in the kind organically, but also, as you rightly said, that all of this sort of justification premises of haq, right, except for citizenship, none of them were used to articulate rights for women. And that they had to kind of, whenever the question of women's rights, whether it was done by indigenous groups, or women's groups, whether it was done by women activists in various other mobilizations, they always went and referred to constitutional guarantees of equal rights for women. And that was very striking, as you pointed out. That's very striking, and I think that that's why one of the reasons they said that is that it's very easy, or much easier, to make claims against the state, right? Because there is some kind of understanding that there will be some kind of hearing. Right? Hearing in the sense, in a very, not in a kind of a very sort of processual sort of way, but there is somebody who at some point may have to listen. But it's actually super, super hard to make claims against one's community. And it's very hard to kind of, and that is why I think that it was much easier to use that language of constitutional guarantees, a much more abstract language of constitutional guarantees than it was to use a language which was actually much more shared and much more immediate and visceral.
I have a long list of questions. I want to make sure anyone else has a chance to ask a question. Yes?
Yeah, forgive my ignorance, but I was wondering, I'm really fascinated by the concept of haq, but I was wondering, how is it different from the concept of natural rights in those Western philosophy?
So I don't know if you heard the question, because we don't have great answers in here, so I'll repeat. So the question is how does the concept of haq compare to concepts of natural rights in Western philosophy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's thank you for that question. I am thinking about that. And it struck me at various points that there might be something there in which people are talking about natural rights. Firstly, because I think haq is a much more capacious than the natural rights concept. Because if you sort of think about it, natural rights as they were espoused were very limited, right? They were limited in terms of who they were meant for, who became the kinds of who they became attached to, and so on and so forth. So in some ways, it is linked to that, but it is also in the practice of haq goes beyond that to encapsulate questions of dignity, questions of one's own moral standing, but also I think there are various other justifications attached to it than simply being the ones that are kind of attributed to natural rights, if you see what I mean. And that's why the cosmological, the Islamic, the moral ideal, and so on and so forth, and citizenship. So they are quite separate justifications that attach to haq. So in that case, haq is much more capacious than the natural rights discourse. But that's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, honestly, that question was really helpful for helping me think through something that I was reading when thinking about reading your book, which is, you argued throughout a good chunk of the book is about how the framework of vernacular rights cultures enables us to sort of displace a discussion around the politics of origins, right? We get to sort of move away from this originary unit of analysing human rights, and I was trying to think through how that effect of your framework related to human rights originalism. So I'll come back to that maybe in another time, but the question about natural rights also is going in that direction. I have another question while we wait for other folks to ask questions too. You mentioned this in your presentation, also it's a theme in the book too, that there has been this, what we could think about as being a negativity, a despair, a pessimism about critical and progressive scholarship on human rights, right? So there's been a sort of whole genre of left scholarship that has left a very uninspiring, unhopeful, almost nihilistic vision of what human rights looks like. And I was trying to think through, I would agree with that. And I was trying to think through what was an example of that really that I work in and that has stuck with me. And one example is you have a whole bunch of progressive scholarship arguing that we have too many human rights. Right, it's like a strand in current scholarship. We have too many human rights. We've expanded the human rights corpus. We've expanded to the point where they've lost meaning, that we don't have core rights guarantees. We've overloaded machinery at the UN for supervising human rights. We've undermined the core rights and elevated ad hoc rights. I'm just wondering, this critique of rights inflation that we talk about a lot in both the progressive and maybe conservative approaches to human rights, how does what your work is finding, how does it relate to that debate? How does that relate to that debate of rights inflation?
Yeah, thank you. I think that some of that debates around rights inflation are very much, as you said, very much about, let's go back to the core, right? So let's talk about civil and political rights, that whole generational rights talk. Is at the center of it, really. It's about, okay, so we've had too many, the core rights are civil and political liberties, civil and political rights, and now, and so on and so forth. And I think that one of the things that comes out of the work on haq is the two things, really. One is the sort of refusal of this generationalism, of this generational rights talk, because of course rights are seen as, indivisible, but they're also interdependent, they are intersectional, they go across, there's nothing like, okay, first we'll have civil and political rights and then we'll have economic rights, please, right? So in that sense, there is this sort of, life rights, or what Reorienting called it, another point, life rights become super important, and those life rights don't, so when somebody's talking about, rights to, work, or right to employment guarantees, or right to forest lands, and so on and so forth, or right to land rights, they're very much, they are sort of seen as a set of rights, right? So in terms of they guarantee the ability to live a life. So in that sense, they are life rights. And so I found that quite refreshing, actually, sort of moving away from this sort of, generational talk, but also this hierarchies of rights, and really in terms of people just sort of say, oh well, rights are indivisible, interdependent, and so on, but actually what they're actually talking about are civil and political rights are interdependent and indivisible when they're not talking about anything else. And I think that that's what I mean when you start looking at the mobilization, rights mobilizations in which the world, so you look at the Via Campesina in Latin America, right? You look at various other mobilizations in different parts of the world, you see this absolute refusal of this generational rights talk. So that was one, and the other one was, of course, that that they were there's also a kind of human rights orthodoxy, which often talks of you see that in the binarism, right? So let's first have economic development, and then we'll talk about other things. But actually, what shows on the ground is that arrows go in both directions simultaneously. So there is nothing like the stagism and the evolutionary stagism that you find in a lot of that inflationary kind of rights talk business.
Great, and thank you very much sort of presaged my question. I would have got to if we had more time, which was exactly, I thought the rationale you gave for using Hark as the entry point and rejecting the global human rights package was so key to this work, right? Because it enabled you to open up and see different movements that were happening that we wouldn't see through a global human rights framework. But the question that I would have invited more explanation of, but again, maybe for another conversation, would have been this question of what are the links between Hark and the global human rights package, and particularly, something you made a point of in your presentation and really emphasizing in your book is the narrative has been very much one of unidirectionality, right? The idea that the global human rights package impacts on these subaltern spaces, in most of the world, and that's then particularized by local groups. And I think, your contribution here in many places that's actually a very limited vision, of how the global human rights package interacts in these moments too. So again, that would be a conversation for another day, because we're out of time, unfortunately. But I want to really say thank you again for joining us, and really looking forward to an ongoing conversation on these topics, and for the vision that you present that really just does disrupt so many of our state-based, institutionally based, Eurocentric narratives that percolate in the human rights space. So thank you for joining us in this discussion, and we look forward to having ongoing engagement on these issues.
Thank you so much. Thank you.